Last week, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines said that Russia is preparing for a prolonged conflict in Ukraine. And while I do think that this message is technically accurate, I also think that many people got the wrong idea about what she meant. Because in many media articles, it was presented as if the war has turned into a frozen conflict, and that is a mistake. The war in Ukraine is not even close to being a frozen conflict. It is a war of attrition, and that's something very different. So in this video, I want to look at the difference between a frozen conflict and a war of attrition. Avril Haines is the Director of National Intelligence in the United States. So she works in the intelligence community, and what they do is to gather knowledge about the intentions and capabilities of the different parties in a conflict. So when you hear an intelligence briefing, it's very normal that it will go through the different parties one by one and try to explain how they see the situation. And what Avril Haines gave at the hearing in the US Senate was exactly that, an intelligence briefing. So she explained how the US intelligence community understands the Russian intentions and capabilities. So this was not an explanation of how the war is actually going, but an expression of how they think the Russians understand the situation. And what Haines actually said was that there is a discrepancy between the Russian intentions and their capabilities, and that this reality will become clear for the Russian leadership over the coming months. And that also, therefore, the conflict is moving into a phase where things can get more unpredictable and escalatory because we don't know for sure how Putin will react. But in many places in the media, this was all reduced to a soundbite where Haines said that Russia is preparing for a prolonged war, and this led many people to assume that the war has turned into a frozen conflict, or at least that it is going to become a frozen conflict. I think that one of the reasons for this misunderstanding was that Haines' briefing did not mention how the Ukrainian side of the conflict looks at it. And in a real war, the enemy always has a vote, so you can't actually understand the war by looking only at one side. But I think that if she had mentioned the Ukrainian viewpoint, then the message would have been more clear. And in essence, she actually said the exact same thing that I said in my video about what the two sides are fighting for. And I called this their visions of victory. And I will insert a link to the video if you want to see it. But in essence, I also said that since the Russian change of focus to Donbass, their goal is essentially that the war should end in an undecided state. So that is a frozen conflict. So to use a sports term, they are playing for a tie, but the Ukrainians are now in a position of strength and they're playing to win. So what we have now in Ukraine is not a frozen conflict. It's very far from a frozen conflict, in fact, because a frozen conflict is a conflict that has low intensity and where the level of attrition is sustainable for both sides. And that's not what we have in Ukraine, because there is a high level of intensity and an attrition level that is unsustainable. So what we have is a war of attrition, and that is very different from a frozen conflict. And it's important that we understand that difference and not mix them up, because they are in fact two totally different situations. One important point is that when you look at the map, then there has been a pretty long period where the front lines haven't moved very much. But this does not mean that nothing is happening. It's an extremely intensive war along those front lines, so there's nothing frozen or even remotely cold about it. And the way a war of attrition works is that you cause your opponent to lose fighting power over time because his losses are bigger than his ability to replace that fighting power. And usually both sides will lose fighting power in that process. And that is probably what we have in Ukraine, that both Russia and Ukraine are experiencing losses, so their fighting power is declining. And there are essentially two ways that this can end. one scenario is that both sides are losing fighting power at the same pace. If this happens, then the intensity of the war will slowly decline and eventually it will turn into a frozen conflict. So in that sense, it is possible that the war in Ukraine can become a frozen conflict at some point, but it is not the situation now. And the other scenario is that one side loses fighting power faster than the other side. In this case, the winner will be the side that has the best capability to handle the attrition, because there will come a point when they can launch an offensive and break the stalemate. So in this situation, the stationary front lines are just a temporary thing. And the big question in Ukraine is, of course, which scenario it will be. Will Russia and Ukraine lose fighting power at the same rate, or will one side handle the attrition better than the other? So what Haines said was that Putin still seems to believe that Russia can handle the attrition in the long run, but that in reality they probably can't, because there are many things that indicate that time is on Ukraine's side in the fight. They seem to be better organized, they have better logistics, they operate on their own territory, and they are receiving a lot of modern weapons from their partners. And on the Russian side, Putin doesn't seem willing to make the kinds of choices that would make the war sustainable. So this would be some degree of mobilization in the Russian society. And I have made another video where I go into detail with all the problems that mobilization would give for Putin. So we are in a situation where Russia's sort of trying to muddle through with some pretty aggressive campaigns to recruit more volunteers for the fighting. But that is probably not going to be enough. So the war of attrition will probably lead to scenario 2, where Ukraine will eventually be able to launch counteroffensives. And then, of course, this can turn into a frozen conflict at some other point. If the Ukrainian forces have success with a counteroffensive, then that can squeeze together the Russian forces so they are more concentrated, and then that can lead to a new stalemate. But right now, it is nowhere near a frozen conflict. It is a war of attrition, which is something completely different. And that is also the point that Avril Haines tried to express, that there seems to be a gap between Putin's intentions with the war and Russia's current capabilities, and that over the coming months, he will probably understand that Russia is losing the competition of attrition. And then we will see how he will react to that situation. Okay, I will end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.